This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Sean Terrell in the Office of Policy Analysis and Development at Administration for Community Living. And thank you for joining this webinar. We're going to be learning about a bunch of new measures that we've been funding over the last several years. And we are also going to encourage anybody who's interested in participating in testing those measures. We'll talk about that as well. We have a really great panel here today. We have Phil Beatty, who is the research director of the National Institute of Disability Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, otherwise known as NIDLR. We have Brian Avery, PhD, he's a principal investigator and co-director of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Home and Community-Based Services Outcome Measurement. He's and the National Center for College Students with Disabilities and the Global Disability Rights and Inclusion Program at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration, ICI, as well as an adjunct faculty at the Special Education Program. He's been the principal investigator on numerous projects designed to enhance self-determination, social inclusion, and employment of youth with disabilities. And he understands the impact of home and community-based services on the outcomes experienced by home and community-based services recipients. And we also have from the same organization, Renata Ticha, is the co-director of the RTC on HCBS Outcome Measures at ACL, and is also a co-director of the National Project of National Significance focused on the transition of youth adults with intellectual disabilities from school to employment, post-secondary education, interdependence, and an adjunct faculty at the special ed program at the university. Dr. Chicha has co-authored many publications on assessment, measurement, and the evaluation of efficacy on interventions, and directs research through the Research and Training Center on Community Living and HCBS Outcome Measurement. And we have, thirdly, we have Matthew Roberts. He serves as the project coordinator for the RTC on HCBS Outcome Measurement here at the Institute for Community Integration. He is a parent of a child with autism and has extensive experience working with healthcare professionals and educators, and believes strongly in the mission of making community more inclusive for people with disabilities. So we're going to just go over a couple of things. I just want to first just point out, like, the ACL has been invested in this idea of developing measures that are really sort of very practical and usable at all levels of the system, not just the state level, but also health plans, which is increasing, and it's been around for a long time in some populations for mental health. It's for providers, so we could learn, compare providers to each other, and just individuals, how well are individuals progressing, and how well are people sort of person-centered preferences, goals, et cetera, being met by all the services that are implemented in that plan. So it's very person-centered oriented. We also believe that measures need to be able to get down into a level of the system that can really see and address racial, ethnic, and LGBTQ and economic inequities, which is a major focus of this administration. And so what we're going to be talking today about is what Brian and Renata and are going to be talking about is a set of measures that we think allows that to happen in a much highly efficient way, and that is much more flexible than a lot of what we have now. We also believe that measures should be across populations. We have, the same measures should apply to everybody to the degree possible, and that they, again, should be low level of burden. So we're very excited about this work. We think this really presents a turning point in how we measure HCBS, and really will help us move forward in a way that we can be much more confident about the data that we have, and much more, and that the data is much more actionable at all levels of the system. So I'm going to hand it over to Phil Beatty, who's going to talk about NIDLR's commitment.
Okay, hi, Sean. Thank you for that important overview of ACL's approach to this important policy area. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I should say good morning to those of you on the West Coast, or perhaps further west. Yeah, but thank you all for for being here. I do want to take just a few short minutes to give you some background, additional background into the work that our ACL and NIDLR grantees have been doing in this space since around 2015. So back then, NIDLR was in its first year as a center within the Administration for Community Living. And this grant opportunity that you're going to hear more about now, and this grant that you're going to hear more about, was one of our first that we made as an ACL center. Then, as now, this opportunity, this effort was very much a team effort among our ACL colleagues. So in our funding opportunity back in 2015, we broadly summarized the aim of this new research grant in this way. We said, the grantee will engage in research, development, and testing of measures to assess the quality of home and community-based services in terms of the person-centered outcomes achieved by people with disabilities who use the services in home and community settings. In short, we said that the measure of quality of HCBS programs and the measure of quality that we're interested in is the assessment of outcomes achieved by service recipients. We went on to say in our funding opportunity that HCBS measures developed by the grantee must be non-medical and must focus on the end user's experience of community living, independent living, social integration, community participation, and other similar outcomes. As a result of this opportunity, we made a research and training center grant to the University of Minnesota. Brian Avery and Renata Ticha are here with us today, as you've heard, to tell us about their ongoing measure development efforts and to share with you potential opportunities to be engaged with them in their work. Please note that this work of building measurement infrastructure is an ongoing effort at NIDLR. In addition to the work that Dr. Avery and Dr. Ticha are just about to tell you about from their home at the University of Minnesota, we also have other grantees working in this important area as well. Our NIDLR grantees at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab are also doing HCBS measurement development work, and we'll look forward in the future to the opportunity to host them for a related webinar in this space. For now, though, I'm just really happy to turn the floor over to Brian Avery, who's going to begin walking you through the University of Minnesota's ongoing, just really thoughtful work in this area. So, Dr. Avery, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Phil. Again, thank you everyone for coming. What we are going to be doing today is talking to you about some of the work we're doing, some of the theory and thought that lies behind it, give you some updates as to where we are today and where we hope to go in the future. I am going to now attempt to share my screen. Have I been successful with that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So we're going to start with something that is truly basic, and from our perspective, what HCBS outcome measurement is all about. As Phil and Sean said, we want to really do two things with the outcome measures that we're developing. Number one, we want to make sure that we're taking a look at the quality of supports that are received by HCBS beneficiaries, including individuals who are aging and individuals who have disabilities. We want to make sure that those supports are of high quality, that they're timely, that they're well coordinated, respectful of the rights of beneficiaries, and they support a high quality of life, a quality of life, which is what the individual themselves wants. Now, taking a look at the quality of supports is one piece of the puzzle. The second piece is taking a look at those personal outcomes that are experienced by individuals who are the recipients of supports through home and community-based services. And we really made a decision from the beginning of our work that we were going to take the National Quality Forum's HCBS Outcome Measurement Framework as a starting point. Now, as we think about measurement and why it should be important to those of you who are providers, there are a number of different reasons. At the kind of top level, there's the notion that measurement will allow you to collect data that show that you're in compliance with both state and federal legislation and policy concerning home and community-based services. But we feel that that really is only the tip of the iceberg. For us, the real importance of quality measurement is that it allows us to really take part in improvement efforts that are driven by data, driven by the information that we're receiving from people with disabilities, their family members when necessary, and providers, so that we can make sure that individuals are getting the best services and supports to allow them to achieve outcomes that are personally important to them. We believe that outcome measurement should be important to you because it's going to provide evidence that the innovations that you institute in your programs are actually achieving desired outcomes and not having any negative unintended impact on the individuals who you serve. And then at the end point, it certainly should provide you with information that allows you to better market your program to potential users, and for users to be able to select home and community-based service programs that meet their specific needs. One of the things that Sean talked about a little were some of the principles underlying HCBS outcome measurement. And as we went about the process that we've engaged in to develop these 13 new measures, we really were driven by the notion that there were some underlying principles that we needed to make sure that all of our measures were attested to. And the first one of those is, I think, probably the most important. We wanted our measures to be person-centered. We wanted our measures not to consist of frequency counts of the number of times people have accessed this service or that, or been out into the community. We wanted to make sure that the measures were actually getting at what was important to people, to the degree that people wanted to engage in those activities, to have that level of control over their life. So number one, measures need to be person-centered. The second piece that we thought really needed to be incorporated into our measure development process was the opportunity for measures to be used longitudinally over time. If you're a provider agency and you are implementing an innovative program, you want measures to use at the beginning and kind of once the program has been instituted, so you can have information to tell you whether your innovation has been successful and has led to the outcomes that you desire your recipients of HCBS to experience. As Sean said, we want to make sure measures are feasible to administer, that they don't put an excessive burden on either the respondents, people who are asking questions of, or to providers. As I said earlier, we really wanted to start with the National Quality Forum's framework for HCBS outcome measurement and some revisions that we've made to it because we thought that that really should be one of the driving forces for measurement in this area over the next decade. And then finally, for those of you who are service providers, we wanted to make sure that the measures that we developed had utility at your level. We have a number of different approaches to measurement that are available now that are great to allow states to show that they're in compliance with the final settings rule and other legislation surrounding HCBS. But we really felt that we needed to get to a deeper level to allow providers to really be able to demonstrate that their services and supports were leading to intended outcomes. A lot of this goes back to this notion of person-centered measurement, and it's something that has driven the work that we've done at our Institute on Community Integration on HCBS outcome measurement from the beginning. And that is the notion that measurement needs to be based upon the experiences, the needs and the goals and the values that people with disabilities themselves express. And we wanted that to inform the decisions that we made about what we were going to measure, how we were going to measure it, and how we were going to evaluate the performance of community-based supports. Now, person-centered measurement is not the same thing as assessing person-centered supports and practices. That should, of course, be person-centered, but we want person-centeredness to underlie all measurement in this area, and that is a type of measurement that balances, what's important for the person with what's important to the person. And that's something that we don't think measurement in the past has done a good enough job at. Now, I know this is a little bit overwhelming for people, but this just gives you an idea of the complexity of the types of things that we believe we need to be assessing at the consumer level, the provider level, and the system level, to understand the outcomes that people with disabilities and people who are aging experience when they receive home and community-based supports, and the quality of services and supports that are being provided. And basically in outcomes, we're taking a look at the degree of community inclusion people experience, the choice and control they have over their services and supports in their daily lives, the degree to which they as consumers of supports have input into system development and system evaluation efforts, the degree to which there's equity in the services and supports that are provided to HCBS recipients, and a number of other areas. We believe that all of these are important because we are really trying to reach across kind of our aging population, older adults, plus individuals with disabilities. We selected on the basis of a lot of nationally based research that we did in the beginning of our center, 13 specific areas that we have focused on. Now, as we think about measurement, there are different levels of measurement. And as we've developed our measures, we tried to keep this in mind. Kind of at the bottom of that pyramid, there are compliance and kind of quality assurance measures at the state level. Next up, we have quality of service delivery, which is at the agency level. And then we have measurement that leads to kind of individual outcomes that affects the lives of real people on a real-time basis. And we have tried to be sensitive to the fact that as we move up this pyramid, we need to increase the level of person-centeredness, maximize it, and we need to also increase the level of precision in measurement. It's one of the things which in home and community-based services, we really felt the need to put more emphasis on, so that when we have measures and when measures are released, the individuals who are users can be assured that they are psychometrically sound and that they can have faith in them. So we went through a number of different phases in our measure development process, starting out with taking that National Quality Forum framework, which has 11 different domains and somewhere between 3 and 7 subdomains within each domain. And we took it out to people with disabilities, people who are aging, family members of those individuals, providers like yourselves, policymakers and researchers. And we asked them to provide input into that framework, to tell us if they thought anything was missing, and to provide us with importance weighting so we could figure out which domains and subdomains, which outcomes, and which kind of aspects of service quality were most important to measure. We then took that information and we compared it to the current measures that we had available, and we did what we refer to as a gap analysis. And we have developed a database that is available on our Research and Training Center site that allows users to look at, I won't say all existing HCBS outcome measures, but a large number of them. And we broke over 130 of these measures down on an item-by-item basis and assessed the degree to which they met those quality indices that we have established, starting out with being person-centered. We then took the input from that gap analysis and our work with stakeholder groups. And that led us to kind of select 13 different National Quality Forum domains and subdomains on which to focus our work. In our next phase, we kind of took those initial domains and subdomains to a number of technical expert panels. And these were individuals with disabilities, family members, and experts in these content areas. And we had them provide us with weightings of their importance, the utility, the usefulness of having measures in these areas, and the feasibility with which they thought measurement data could be collected. As a result, we basically have, focused our work on developing measures in 13 different areas that focus on the left-hand side on 8 different domains, or 7 different domains within the National Quality Forum's outcome measurement model. And within each of those domains, anywhere from 1 to 3 subdomains. So you can see that we have focused our measures on developing measures of choice and control. And we have 3 different measures of choice and control, one of which looks at personal choices and goals, one of which looks at choice with respect to supports and services, and a third one which focuses on individuals who were part of self-directed support programs. We've looked at community inclusion and developed 2 measures in that area: employment, human and legal rights, transportation, a very important piece of the National Quality Forum model that was missing until we got input from stakeholders and people with disabilities. People who are part of our aging population told us without good transportation, it doesn't matter how many resources are available within their area, they can't access them unless they can get to them. Consumer leadership and system development and person-centered planning and coordination were also other areas in which we engaged in measure development efforts. Now, as I said earlier, our initial measure development efforts kind of started out with those domains and subdomains from the National Quality Forum's outcome measurement framework. We then did something which we don't think has been done enough in our field before, is we did an intensive review of current research related to each of the measurement constructs that we were developing. We really wanted to know what the current research was saying about what are the components of social connectedness. What really needs to be present for an individual to feel socially connected to significant others, socially connected to their community. What were the important components of an individual feeling that they had choice and control or self-determination over their lives. And after that intensive review of the current literature and current research, we then developed a set of guiding questions or claim statements. And those basically are questions that we believe that our measures will be able to answer for providers and for individuals who are recipients of home and community-based services. We then kind of took a look at Neidler's charge, which was develop measures that basically allowed us to cut across different groups of HCBS participants. And the groups that our measures focus on are 4 groups with disabilities, in addition to older adults who don't necessarily have disability, but who receive HCBS services and supports. So our measures have been developed with these groups in mind and have been tested with these groups: individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people with physical disabilities, psychiatric disabilities or mental health challenges, and traumatic or acquired brain injury. And then, of course, older adults who receive home and community-based services and supports. Now, we believe that the characteristics of a measurement system need to fit the needs of the people who are going to be using it. And while we currently have a number of instruments that have been developed that can be used to assess all aspects of home and community-based services, we thought we really needed to take a different approach. And that is develop our measures in a modular format. So we haven't developed an instrument, but 13 different measures that providers or states can pick and choose from. And each measure can be used independently or in conjunction with other measures. We thought that was important because in getting these measures down to a level where they could be used by providers, we understood the fact that if a provider is doing an innovative program to enhance the social inclusion of HCBS recipients, they don't necessarily want to be measuring things that have to do with choice and control or with consumer leadership in system development and design. We wanted our measures to be able to be used longitudinally so that they could be used in quality improvement efforts. And in order to make our measures feasible, we've developed our measures so that they have 2 tiers. In the first tier, there are 3 to 5 general items that are intended to provide users with a kind of an overview of the individual's outcomes within a specific domain or subdomain. And across those 13, measures, you're thinking of somewhere in the neighborhood of 39 to 40 items, which would allow you to get a general picture of how, as a provider agency, for example, you're doing in providing supports that lead to these person-centered outcomes. At the second tier, we have additional items, and that tier and those items are really meant for providers to be able to kind of do a deeper dig down into kind of the outcomes that their HCBS recipients are experiencing and really get what we refer to as actionable data which will give you information about if you need to make changes, if you need to do some type of innovative practices in order to achieve the outcomes that you and your recipients want to achieve. It should provide you with that type of information. Now, while most of the people who we have worked with can respond to these questions on their own, persons with disabilities and older adults, we do realize that individuals who have the most significant disabilities, the most intensive support needs, might not be able to take part in an interview, be that a Zoom meeting interview or an in-person interview, and respond to these questions. So in addition to kind of our general measures, we also have developed measures that can be responded to by proxy. They're an abbreviated set of measures and are intended to be answered by a person who knows the individual who is the HCBS recipient well. I am now going to turn things over to Renata, and she is going to talk a bit about kind of the measure development trajectory, which we have followed, which is based upon the CMS Measure Development Blueprint and the results of our pilot study and what we are currently doing at a national level in order to collect validity and reliability data. Renata?
Thank you, Brian. Before I start, there were some notes in the chat about whether we can make the text a little bit larger. Is there a way you can click on the A and then enlarge the slide text?
I do not know whether that is possible, Renata.
We just made it smaller. Okay. Oh. So I don't want to waste time. So Brian has already presented a lot of information. I know it's a lot to digest, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the visual represents the various phases that we went through in order to make sure that the measures are reliable and have good validity, good accuracy, and are going to be usable at the end of the day to providers. And so we currently are in the last phase. It's been a long journey, but we are in phase 5, and we have gone through all of those different pieces, including cognitive testing, piloting, further revision, and now we are testing at a large scale. Next slide. And so before cognitive testing, we have gathered several technical expert panels to review the approach we were taking to measure development, as well as the content for each of the sets of measures. For example, participation in meaningful activity, to make sure that we are covering the latest concepts, the latest research in the field, and also that people with disabilities themselves, family members, were supportive of those ideas. We conducted cognitive testing, meaning that we had to make sure that the way we worded our questions and constructed our response options was understandable to as many people as possible, even those with intellectual disabilities. We have conducted a pilot study. I'll describe that on the next slide. So we had a sample of over 100 participants for our pilot study. The purpose and the importance of the pilot study was to really start testing the initial accuracy, reliability, and validity of the measures. The pilot was conducted in Minnesota and Pennsylvania, and we tried to get as representative of a sample as we could. You can see some of the breakdown on the slide. Next slide. And it was because it was at a time when COVID was just starting. So we did manage to conduct 85 in-person interviews before the pandemic really began. And then we finished online, and we were able to test the measures with those two modes, and including inter-rater observations, so meaning using two people who administered the measures, and also testing, retesting the measures within a 2-week period. So I'm not going to dwell on these numbers, but the numbers are important to us because they indicate the level of different types of reliability that these measures demonstrated. And you can see the range is there between 0 and a 1, and the higher the number, the better the measure is. And you can see that most of the measures really displayed high levels of internal consistency and the other two types of reliability. So we were very, very pleased with the pilot results. So as I indicated with the table, the measures overall demonstrated initial really good properties. There were two measures, freedom from abuse and neglect and barriers to employment, which had slightly lower levels of reliability, at least in one of the categories. And so we substantially revised those measures based on the pilot study. Other things that we learned through the initial testing is that, as Sean indicated at the very beginning, the measures are designed to be used across people with different types of disabilities. And the measures, the results really indicated that there were no significant differences in the levels of accuracy, reliability these measures displayed. Which was a really good finding. It means that we can administer the same measure to an individual with an intellectual or developmental disability and to someone, for example, who has a traumatic brain injury. The piloting also was evidence, even if it was indirect, to validate the NQF framework that we use to build our measures from. And we also found that people with all types of disabilities were able to respond to the questions, and the response options produced reliable data. So the other thing that our measures do, they have two levels. They include tier 1 questions. It's usually 2 to 3 questions, kind of that get at a global concept of that measure, for example, social connectedness. And then there is additional questions that follow. And that structure has worked well in the initial administration. In the study we are conducting now, which is the large national field study, we will be further examining the relationship between these two levels of questions, so that we potentially could use the tiers separately. Of course, we are going to be conducting other analysis, including factor analysis, to investigate the subscales of these measures and look at the relationship between the measures themselves. So now, where we are at in the last phase of testing these measures before they will be available to the general public, the goal is to test the measures on a population of 1,000 people with different types of disabilities. And that's, as you can imagine, is a very large undertaking, but it's very, very important to us that we do that so that we know that the measures have good quality. We are recruiting in various ways. And one of the reasons why we have this webinar today is that we are hoping that some providers, service providers, will be interested in helping us out to finish testing these measures. So we have those measures that Brian already presented. There's about 12, 13 of them. We do the data collection either online using Zoom or in person. We are trying to test the measures on using 3 data points, so 3 times. And then we also have a subsample of people without disabilities to make sure that we are really not treating people with disabilities differently, but have similar expectations within, of course, the limits of that disability may present. So, as I said, we are very actively recruiting participants. We are recruiting participants from the United States at a provider level. So our goal is that we would contact, or we would have an interest from more providers. We already have very many, but we need more. And then we would provide the service provider with more information. Our project coordinator or center coordinator, Matt Roberts, will be able to step in. We provide training, technical assistance. We have a really solid infrastructure, how to collect this data. We have all of the ethical review approvals, so this is a smooth process for us, but we just need more providers to be interested in helping us test these measures. The individual participants will get a gift card for participation. And we have a contact on this slide. If you're interested, we will share the contact widely. It's also at the end of our presentation as well. If we can go to the next slide. I'm going to just touch on why you would want to do this, in addition to the fact that it's a good scientific practice, is that you will have a stake of input into the validation process of these measures. The perspective of the people that you serve will be represented, will take into account anything that is not working or that's not worded correctly, or the people are having trouble responding to. And it will provide actionable data that will give you an idea of what these data look like if you wanted to adopt these measures in the future. You will understand better what goes into making a measure a really good measure to be used widely. And you will also then be one of the first people after this is finished to receive training how to use these measures if you so choose to. So the final goal of this center, as Sean and Phil introduced it, is really not to develop a whole measurement program, but really to generate measures that can be used at the provider level with actionable data, and to be able to use the information and the data for states, for providers, advocacy, self-advocacy organization, to really advocate for better quality of life using the indicators, using the outcomes in which we have developed these measures. And our measures, well, there will be no charge to use the measures, but there is going to be, of course, a requirement for training to use them appropriately. So this is our final slide. Again, we would love if service providers were interested in assisting this effort. If you are, please use any of our contacts, preferably our center coordinator, Matt Roberts, that's the last email. And then I'm sure that we'll share this information as well in the chat, in Q&A, within the PowerPoint slides. And thank you very much for your time. I would be happy to answer questions.
Sean, we'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Okay, thanks. Thanks for an excellent presentation. A lot to chew on, I think, for the average person who's not a researcher, which I think is really good because it gives us all, I think, an opportunity to think about how we know when we see a measure, what kind of questions we might want to ask about how well it was tested and et cetera. So I guess I'll just go right into a couple of questions that came out through the chat and in the Q&A section. First one was that, yeah, will the presentation and the recording, et cetera, be available? And the answer is yes. We're going to post them on the ACL website. I put the link to that in both the chat and the Q&A, so you should be able to see that there. It's going to take a little bit of, it won't be like today. It might be a little bit of time to get it up there. So maybe check back in a week or two, or et cetera. And we'll eventually get it up there. The other questions, a bunch of really good ones in here. Well, first of all, I want to just, a couple of people have already sort of providers have expressed interest in participation. So that's really great. We really love to get these tested so we can get them out to people to use. If you are interested, just please email. Use email here on the final slide to either Brian or Renata. They'd be happy to get you connected. Or actually, there's a specific email here on the bottom to use if you're interested. So, but any one of those out there, even me, whoever you want to email, we'll make sure we get to the right place. So no wrong door here on getting to the testing. And we don't, I think there is a one pager, someone just pulled that up. There is a one pager flyer that I believe they have, but let me let Brian or Renata answer that one.
Yes, we do have a one-page flyer for recruitment purposes. We also have videos that providers who are interested can use. They're very short, 1.5 minute, 2-minute videos that you can show to those individuals who you provide supports and services to encourage them to take part in this process. And again, that's something that we can get to you very easily in addition to the flyer. One of the things I do want to make sure people understand is essentially we're asking you to help us recruit individuals who are willing to take part in this. We will do the interviewing. We have interviewers probably in 8 or 9 different states now, so we have people in all time zones. We can do interviews via Zoom meeting, which is how most of them are being conducted, but we can also do face-to-face interviews if that's necessary.
Great. So I'll jump to a couple other questions if that's all right. Which I think get into some meaty issues here. Well, the first one is
Sean, I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. Brian, can you stop sharing your screen for me real quick so that way when you guys answer the questions, I can bring everyone on the screen? Thanks.
Great. Okay, thanks. I think the contact info is now in the chat for interest in participation in testing. So another question is, did you consider including a workforce related measure, which is obviously a major issue these days? Does Brian or Renata want to take a stab at that?
I can take a stab at it. We have our colleagues here at the Institute on Community Integration who are doing work in that area. Because of the input that we got from people with disabilities, families, and providers, our notion was to start with a focus on those personal outcomes for the most part. And then I believe that some of our colleagues at UIL are also in Northwestern are focusing on that with the new RTC and outcome-based measurement.
And I would also add on, like one of the things that this is really important. So when you say that, so there's a measure looking at community inclusion, the degree to which you feel part of your community, et cetera. And when you get responses that say, well, no, I don't feel I'm part of the community, I'm not really feeling included, that some of the causes of that may be the workforce related. So once you start digging into the answers, it may be that, wow, we all know there's a lot of workforce issues on particularly around since COVID around providing community-based supports, right? So I think that, what do you think of that, Brian, or that approach, or that thinking?
Certainly, I think that's true. Our colleagues here at the Institute will be, I think within the next 2 or 3 weeks, releasing a workforce primarily focused on direct support providers survey to take a look at what is going on in the workforce at this point. They've done this 3 previous times, both pre-COVID and during COVID. And that hopefully will provide us with a lot of good information on that area. It's a sample of, I think the first iteration had over 10,000 direct support providers who actually responded to it.
Great, thanks. Let's move on to a couple more questions. One is kind of sort of trying to go in order here, but I'm bouncing back and forth between Q&A and chat. From a Q&A, there was a question or thought about my experience is that people with IDD often tend to give an answer that they feel is expected of them, right? When people are with intellectual impairment are interviewed. Did you consider subtle coercion by support staff if they are indeed present in the testing?
We have gone to great lengths to make sure that individuals are in a private setting when they are being interviewed, just because of that question. We've also tried to design our items because we know that sometimes people with intellectual disabilities have kind of an acquiescence response set and are likely to say yes, to avoid asking satisfaction items, because as our former colleague and former director of NIDLR, Charlie Lakin, used to say, 85% of people are 85% satisfied with 85% of the services they get 85% of the time. So we've avoided those types of questions, primarily to try to get at questions that allow us to get a better indication of the quality of supports people are getting and the outcomes that they are personally experiencing.
Great. There's another question that's related to sort of the participant in this case. So would this work for people who are verbal and nonverbal? And is there a certain level, sort of, I guess, I don't know what level, but the cognitive level, I guess, that you need people to participate?
Right. So that is a really good question. As far as for the participant responding themselves, we have a scale that we use to determine whether the person's responses can be really valid or reliable. So we go through that when we do our consent process. But if the person is not really able to understand the questions we're asking, we then will ask a proxy respondent. For example, it can be a family member, it can be a support staff, it can be a friend to respond. We have versions of these measures for proxy respondents so that we don't omit really anyone from testing.
The other thing that we have experimented with as we have been going through this process is the use of visuals to help individuals understand the concepts that we are asking them questions about, and to provide them with an approach to responding that doesn't require a verbal response.
Okay, great. Let's see if we can get to a couple more here out of the Q&A. After testing, will measures be able to be collected using different modes such as telephone, online, and/or mail? Snail mail, I think.
Right. So right now, our two main modes are in person and online. We have had several participants who were not able to use online Zoom So we did a phone interview, but our preference is Zoom online or in person.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, it's very difficult for a lot of the, I mean, this is a challenge for the field in general to get to some really strong protocols about how to do ask questions around measures among different groups of people. And I think that's, hopefully we get to one of the projects that, from a policy perspective, we're trying to get to is some protocols that are really effective that other measure developers can use. And this project is helping us develop those. There are others as well. Okay. Let's see. Are the measures only applicable to Medicaid, HCBS, or might they be used by a provider in a private pay long-term care insurance room with good validity? Are there limits on the program side to who these measures would apply to?
I would say that the only real limits is that, the questions are, and the items are designed for individuals who are receiving some form of home and community-based services or the equivalent to home and community-based services. We know that there are some states who provide supports to individuals with mental health challenges, not under HCBS, but are under other programs. They were applicable to those individuals. I would say that they weren't intended to be applicable to individuals who are in institutional settings.
So how long does it take to do? So this is a really important question. You kind of mentioned it, but I think that let's make sure people are clear on how the time requirement is around one or more of these measures.
We basically look at the amount of time it takes to administer measures as opposed to the whole group of all 13 measures we've developed, given the fact that they, are not intended to necessarily be administered as an instrument. And, I would say that if you're talking about administering both tier 1 and tier 2 items, it takes anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes to work through a measure. Okay, again, we developed these measures in a modular format because we didn't necessarily foresee their actual use after validation being as an instrument. Certainly as we're going through our field testing, would like to see as many of these measures administered as possible with each individual.
Okay, great. Somebody's asking for an example of one or more of the measures. I know you had a slide that kind of laid out at least the topical areas. I don't know if she's asking specifically about all the questions that go under a measure, but maybe just pick a measure to describe a little bit more about it. That might help.
Okay, Renata, maybe you can help me with this, and Matt, feel free to chime in. One of the measures that we developed has to do with social connectedness. And, one of the problems that we saw with existing members of social connectedness is they really just asked people how many times, how frequently they got to see family, how frequently they got to see friends. Our measure in that area, focuses on a number of different parts of the social connectedness construct. Not only do you get to see your friends, do you get to see people who you want to be part of your social network, but do you get to see them enough to meet your needs? Do you get to see them in the environments in which you get to see them? And another important point that we found missing in most measures of social connectedness is that social connectedness has been found by research to be closely related to the individual having the opportunity both to receive various types of social support and to provide social support to others. So we have some questions that look at various aspects of social support so that we can see whether that individual social network is providing them with the social emotional support, the informational support, the other types of support, which will help them feel included in their community.
Thank you. I don't know. I understand that you would be willing to share, all the research results. I mean, you have really extensive measure blueprints on each of these measures, which this is great. It's like a literature review in and of itself of everything that's out there on these topics. So that might be useful to other people when we get these out to the world.
For
as well.
individuals who are, interested in participating in the, the field testing, we're more than willing to share those blueprints. It's a lot of good bedtime reading. Each of the blueprints is about 30 pages, single spaced, and kind of goes through the process that we went through, including the review of the literature, the, whole kind of item development process. But certainly when these measures are ready to be released, each measure, which we hope will get eventual NQF endorsement, will come with a measure blueprint so people can see exactly how they were developed.
Right, and if you want a little more digestible format, we do have on our website several briefs that get at some of these topics in a more shorter way. We also have modules that we have developed. We call them training modules, but they are really very digestible informational modules about HCBS outcome measurement, including information about these measures.
There's a follow-up, thank you. There's a follow-up on the time question, which is that, okay, this is probably about the last, we're gonna have one more question after this, we'll see. 15 minutes to work through a measure, and there are whatever number of people, whatever number of tier 1, tier 2 measures, X, whatever, it's like 14. So equals how much time to set aside for an interview? I think the question is assuming all of the measures, if you did all of them at once, including both for tier 1 and tier 2. I guess there'd be 2 numbers.
Okay, if you were to administer all of those 13 measures, at once, it would probably take, I would say, anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes for a full interview. Again, what we foresee is these interviews, or these items initially being administered with tier 1, and then providers taking a look at, on the basis of the tier 1 responses, what areas do we need more in-depth data on, and then delving into those areas with tier 2 questions.
So, yeah, I mean, I think also, part of the question that we have in this is, since these are modular, you can ask, you can sit down with somebody in the context of a case management visit or sort of conceptually, assuming the training's there, and ask during the context of a visit you're going to make anyway, ask some questions, roll out a measure or 2 in that visit. And then the next one you could ask other questions if you want, and that becomes, it's flexible at that level. And if there's a way to think about this, and I think this is for everybody who might be joining the testing thing, a way to think about this in the context of how to incorporate these sort of flexible measures into existing workflow across your system would be we'd all be very interested in that, about how that might work and be a more efficient way of doing measures than sitting down and doing a long interview with a whole bunch of measures at the same time. So that's kind of the hope, that these modular measures offer that kind of support. I know we're at time, and I think we got to most of the questions. I probably didn't, somebody asked me for my title. It's a health insurance specialist, right? I usually leave it out because it's so bureaucratic, nobody knows what it means. So that's it. I'm in the Office of Policy Analysis and Development. So I think we're ready to wrap up now with any final words, I guess, from any of the presenters, Brian and Renata.
All I do is like to say that, we are very interested in working with, any providers out there who would be interested in being part of this process. We are working right now in about 15 different states. We are working with a couple of MCOs as part of this process, because we do realize that home and community-based services are increasingly being provided through the managed care approach. I guess what I would say kind of in leaving is, if you have any further questions or need additional information, prior to making a decision as to wanting to participate, or you just have questions about what we're doing here at our Research and Training Center, please feel free to, contact either Renata, myself, or our center coordinator, Matt Roberts, because as part of the responsibilities of our center, we also provide free technical assistance when people have measurement questions and want to make sure that we support kind of increasing the quality of measurement, regardless of whether you're using the measures that we're developing or other measures. Renata, anything you'd like to add to that?
And it really doesn't matter to us whether you're a small or large service provider. We will work with a provider of any size in any part of the United States.
Well, with that, I guess we'll wrap up our discussion today. We're all very excited about this, and we're really happy that we had so many people on and excellent questions. And if you have additional questions, you could address me, you could address Brian, Renata, whoever you'd like to. My email's in the ACL announcement, so you click that. We'll make sure we get them responded to on an ongoing basis. Okay, well, that's it. I guess we'll say goodbye then.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We appreciated your attention.